Ford reported its U.S. retail sales surged 19% in March compared to just 5% during the whole first quarter. The uptick comes ahead of planned tariffs on U.S. auto imports later this week that could raise prices by thousands of dollars, according to estimates. Here to discuss what this week's tariffs could mean for the industry, we've got John Murphy. He is BofA's Securities Senior Automotive Analyst. John, thank you so much for being here. When thinking about these Ford retail sales numbers jumping in the month of March, I'm curious, could that potentially be bad news for them moving forward? If this is customers getting ahead of any potential tariffs, could we potentially see a big drop looking ahead? And how are you modeling the impact of that kind of consumer behavior?
So thanks for having me today. We're down to the wire on these tariffs, and everybody is scrambling in their analysis as well as their lobbying in D.C. I think what we saw with the Ford numbers, and we'll see with other numbers as they roll out later today, for March in the first quarter, is that the consumer is a bit freaked out. They're acting somewhat logically and going in and trying to buy the vehicles they may need in the coming months or maybe coming years ahead of these very significant hikes in prices as a result of tariffs. And sort of simply, as we think about this, the vehicles that are being imported, the pricing could rise as much as $10,000 to offset the tariffs. And there's a varying degree of vehicles that are produced here in the U.S., which is about half the sales, are going to need to go up quite substantially as well, because there's reported or proposed tariffs on auto parts. And that's the part of the equation that the industry is lobbying hard for. I generally agree with that you shouldn't have tariffs on certain parts or maybe all parts in vehicles, because everybody is hit by that. So if you think about Ford being the best positioned automaker here in the U.S. of the incumbents, traditional players, they're still going to have a heavy tax or tariff burden in their vehicles from those parts. So that is something that their consumers will face, as well as the consumers at Mazda, Nissan, and some other brands that will have sort of huge import tariffs put on them.
Hey, John, it's Julie here. And I have to say your note where you lay out the exposure was invaluable last week in trying to make sense of the impacts of all of this. So that swing of the parts that you're talking about, as you mentioned, reportedly the automakers are lobbying the administration to have the parts be exempted. What is the swing there? You know, for a company like Ford, for example, if the parts get tariffed versus if they don't?
So, Julie, everybody, including us, is crunching these numbers, and we'll hopefully be back sometime very soon with some more detail. The problem is the detail is impossible to figure out because the rules are not set yet. So what we're looking at right now in the initial fact sheet and proposal by the White House is that parts are going to be tariffed. The focus is powertrain and electronics to start, but that may not be the final ruling, and it's by May 3rd that we'll get an answer to this. So we have another month to go to understand what parts are going to be tariffed, how the rules are going to be worked out. But the reality is assembly in the United States could make sense of vehicles, for vehicles, right? Just based on labor costs, there's not that much of a differential. That would hopefully happen over 5 years, not immediately, because doing that immediately would be damaging. But as far as parts, particularly things like wiring harnesses, other injection moldings, other parts of the vehicle, the labor costs are pretty high relative to the part itself. The reality is there's not enough Americans to make those parts, and those parts probably should never really come back to the United States. Assembly, maybe, but it's very dangerous to raise tariffs on those parts, hurt all automakers across the board, and really drive costs up for American consumers. So I think the lobbying that's going on right now is actually fairly logical and directed in the right direction. Now, when you get to powertrain, there is the argument that you could potentially bring more of that back to the United States. That would be engines and transmissions, but even that is a questionable decision. So we're still all working through this right now.
John, my Roman empire for the morning is this quote from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Fox News saying that there could potentially be a tax write-off for American auto purchases. How are you thinking about that? How are you thinking about the consumer impact of that? And how do you price in these kind of seemingly flippant comments from various members of the Trump administration into your models at this time?
Well, we're taking everything into account that everybody is saying at the moment, and there are varying degrees of disagreements in some of those statements. I think the idea that you would use auto interest expense to the consumer as a deduction for their AGI, so they would pay lower taxes, I think is interesting, but that's peanuts in the equation of what we're talking about right now. It's a good talking point, but it really doesn't change the equation based on what we're talking about right now. I think the real extreme risk here is twofold. One, the 7.6 million units that are being imported to the United States. The manufacturers might decide not to make those vehicles and import them to the U.S. So we might have a whole lot less vehicles available to the American consumer, which actually is pretty bad, as we can all, I think, generally agree. And the second fold is when we talk about these parts tariffs. When you get beyond sort of the known tier ones that we all cover in the public markets, there's a number of tier twos and threes that feed into those tier one components. The reality is some of those parts might just not get made, and we face an extreme risk here in the short term of North American production going to zero for a period of time. That would be a real shock to the system, but it's not impossible based on the way things are being discussed right now. So I think everybody really needs to take a step back, particularly in the auto industry, where I'm Max and could speak as an expert, and take a breath and figure out what is logical here, particularly on the parts side, so that we don't have an extreme disruption where half the industry or the entire industry is taken down.
Yeah, well, I don't know if logic is what is the governing factor here, John. We will find out. Lastly, got to ask you about Tesla, which, as your research showed, what we showed earlier, doesn't really have a large tariff exposure, even though, yes, it imports some parts, but its cars that it sells in the U.S. are made in the U.S. But it's got other issues, shall we say. So I'm curious what your current thinking is on that, especially ahead of getting some delivery numbers from Tesla, and how long you think maybe some of the sales issues there are going to persist.
So it's a great question. This is a company where sentiment matters almost as much as the fundamentals, but fundamentals always matter. And I think what you look at with Tesla is they're going through a massive changeover, their Model Y, both here in the US, Europe, and China. So there's some real disruption that's going on as they're going through a major product changeover. That's about 2/3 of their volumes globally, roughly. So that's been very disruptive to their ability to get vehicles to consumers and sell them. So you have to remember that that's going on. At the same time as an entry-level model, which is supposed to be launched in the first half of the year, we have no specifics or details on yet, so it's unlikely to be launched by June. That product cycle, changeover in the product cycle of new products coming is all important to driving new vehicle sales. And I think if you think about this company as a software and AI company over time, you still need to get the hardware out there to put that software and AI on in the real world. So these product cycles are going to be very important. So I think that's a fundamental challenge for the company here in the short run. The sentiment side is sentiment's pretty bad towards the brands. And obviously there's a lot of political cross currents that are going on here that people I think are conflating a little bit too much with damage to the brand or pressure on the brand. But there's a lot going on here. Sentiment is incredibly negative, and that's often when this stock bottoms out. So we're going to have to keep a close eye on it. We're currently neutral, but it's going to be a messy first quarter for them because of that changeover and some of the sentiment going on. But there's going to be opportunity over time for this to be, probably a pretty solid company over time.
John, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.